So today I'm going to talk about how fingerprint analysis and fingerprint identification isn't as reliable as many people believe. So a little bit about how fingerprint identification is done. Fingerprints have friction ridges on it, and they're categorized into three groups. There's loops, whorls, and arches. And from these patterns, examiners compare the patterns from a known print and an unknown print and determine if it's a match. But the rate of false matches is actually quite high. From two studies, the rate of false matches is 1 in 18 and 1 in 30. And I know I personally have always thought this, and I know a lot of people have as well. People always say that no two people can have similar fingerprints. Each person's fingerprint is completely different and unique, but there's actually no scientific study to prove that that's even true. And in the case of Brandon Mayfield, you'll see that it's not true at all. So fingerprint examiners use an ACE-V method, which stands for analysis, comparison, evaluation, and verification. And this is really the only standard that examiners use. There's really a lack of scientific foundation when it comes to fingerprint identification, and there's really no specific formula examiners use to determine whether there is a match. So two laboratories could get the same sets of fingerprints and could come back with completely different results. And there's also no standard for the number of points of similarity, which means that one laboratory could find 7 points of similarities and then rule that the two fingerprints are a match, and other laboratories could find 15 points or 18 points or whatever, and there's really no formula for how to find a match. In 2009, the National Academy of Sciences produced a report about strengthening forensic sciences, and they really brought a lot of attention to the fact that friction ridge analysis or fingerprint identification doesn't have capacity and doesn't have a high degree of certainty, because many fingerprint examiners say that there's a 0 error rate, that it's 100% certain and infallible, and that's not true at all. And this NAS report actually was huge because a lot of defendants in criminal trials filed a motion of appeal and used the challenge of fingerprint analysis and how it's not reliable to appeal their case. So now I'm going to talk about the case of Brandon Mayfield. In May 6 of 2004, Brandon Mayfield, who was an American lawyer, was arrested and detained. He was suspected to be involved in a Madrid bombing that happened in March of 2004. And that bombing killed almost 200 people and injured 2,000 people. And they found a plastic bag of detonators in a stolen van near where the bombs were set off. And this plastic bag had one fingerprint on it. And this fingerprint was said to match Brandon Mayfield's fingerprint, even though Mayfield claimed he never been to Spain and he never even left the United States in the past 10 years. But 4 different FBI fingerprint examiners all said they were 100% certain that Mayfield's print matched the print found on the plastic bag of detonators. One examiner in particular, Terry Green, identified 15 points of identification during his comparison of Mayfield's prints. And they said they were all 100% positive, but this turned out to not be true. So Mayfield was detained for 2 weeks. And right before his trial, he was actually deciding whether he was going to get up on the stand and testify. They discovered that the real source of the print belonged to an Algerian man. So this one print found could have potentially sent Brandon Mayfield to jail for life, which is why I don't think fingerprint analysis can be relied on in court. I think it's it's an important piece of evidence in criminal trials, but I don't think it should be the only piece of evidence that can determine someone's conviction. And actually, I found an interesting fact that says, in the context of fingerprint identification, for example, studies have found that a vast majority of jurors agree that fingerprint identification is a science and that fingerprints are the most reliable means of identification, which I think is really huge because it basically says that if jurors hear that someone's fingerprint is at the scene of a crime, they're automatically going to assume that person's guilty. So it has a lot of weight on jurors' decision whether to convict someone or not. But if something isn't even always 100% certain, I don't see how that can be used as an important piece of evidence. It's known as the gold standard, and I don't think that should be the case because it's really not accurate at all. There's no scientific studies to really back up that it's an effective way, an effective science. And also, in 1923, a former Secret Service agent developed a fingerprint forgery method, and it actually was successful in planting a fake print of a California police officer at the scene of a burglary, which is just another reason why it shouldn't be relied on in court. And there's also a thing known as cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is a term that refers to the systematic ways in which the context and framing of information influences individuals' judgment and decision-making. And this was huge in the Brandon Mayfield case because the FBI examiners went into looking at the two fingerprints already with an idea that Brandon Mayfield was guilty of it. And because of this, they kind of framed their information to confirm their pre-existing beliefs. So they found certain spots in the two fingerprints that matched and then just determined from there that Mayfield was guilty of the crime. And so as I said earlier, the NAS report really brought a lot of attention to the credibility of fingerprint identification, and a lot of criminal trials, defendants used the NAS report in their appeals, and I found some cases that this happened. So in Commonwealth v. Gambora, United States v. Rose, Donnie Love's case, State v. Sheehan, People v. Luna. So they all challenged fingerprint identification that linked them to a crime. Most of their motions were denied, but I thought it was interesting to see how more and more the credibility of fingerprint identification is being questioned. So I hope I persuaded a lot of you to think about fingerprint analysis and if it's really as credible as it seems or not. Thank you.